Hello, everyone. So we're going to have a fireside chat conversation with Christine Casper, the General Counsel of Greenpeace International. So this is very exciting for me. I think it's probably the first corporate law event in which Kristen is going to talk as a corporate law invitee. So we're definitely crossing some boundaries here. And I'm particularly excited to talk to her because she is one of the people that are using litigation as a way to move climate, to make impact on climate change and make progress on climate change. And as you know, there are two kinds of lawyers, those who love litigation and those who fear litigation. And corporate lawyers have traditionally been the kind of people that fear litigation. So I'm very excited to hear from her. But first off, I'd like to kick us off by asking you to introduce us a little bit to what Greenpeace does and how litigation fits into that mold. Because for some people, Greenpeace is more connected with activism and I would say bold acts of activism. That's what you were known for. So how does litigation fit into that? It's open.
Does this work? There we go. Thank you, everyone, for having me here. Thank you for having me on the stage with you. This is a real pleasure. So first, I have a question for all of you. Have you seen images of Greenpeace out in the high seas stopping whaling? Raise your hand. Okay. Have you seen images of Greenpeace hanging a banner at a shareholder meeting? All right, we're seeing quite a lot. All right, how many of you have seen Greenpeace photos around the world meeting with communities that have been hit by an extreme weather event? Okay. So I think that's a great place to start because that is what my team is doing. We work on strategic climate litigation where we are taking a movement lawyering approach. And most people would never think that Greenpeace would be doing this, but I think it is a sign of our times. So first, let me just tell you a little bit about Greenpeace. I work for Greenpeace International, which is the coordinating body of the Global Greenpeace Network. So there's 25 national and regional Greenpeace organizations in the world that operate in 55 countries. So it's huge, it's massive. It's a big, big network of people campaigning. And what are we campaigning on? Well, our mission is around protecting and conserving nature. It is around prevention of pollution and the abuse of Earth's air, water, and resources. And it's about promoting peace and global disarmament. We have values, which I think are kind of interesting in the corporate space. So one of the values that we often say is no permanent enemies, no permanent foes. So we're really also well known for our corporate campaigns, where we target a particular company to move and to take action, whether it's Coca-Cola or some, Mattel, Barbie, all these kind of high-profile brand campaigns. So we will align. If we find a company that is doing good things, we will applaud, we will align, we will partner, we will go out there and sing their praises. But if something goes wrong and they start moving away and moving in ways and behaviors that are destructive, then we're back to being foes. So no permanent enemies, no permanent foes. Personal responsibility is also a big thing. So we do peaceful protest, and that is based on our fundamental rights to free speech, freedom of association, and peaceful protest. So we take responsibility for our actions. Another one is that for Greenpeace is that we really believe that peaceful nonviolence is an important way of making change. But peaceful nonviolence can happen in different tools, and strategic litigation is one of them. So that's
So something that I noticed. So I'm going to ask you a lot of questions about litigation, but something that I noticed is that there is a very close connection between your litigation strategy and the idea of human rights. So there's a close connection between environment and human rights, and that's something that you're pioneering. So tell us more about that and why they make good friends or a good pair, and how you're using kind of the overlap.
Okay, that's a great question, because it is really true when you look at the kind of overall cases that we're bringing. A lot of them are based on human rights law, and you have to look at our campaign's premises, like our basic premises of the Greenpeace's Global Climate Justice and Liability Campaign. The first one is people have rights, and this is that every single one of us, every single one of you in this room, has a right to a healthy environment. Second, governments have duties. They have an obligation to protect human rights, the rights of all of ours. And then the third premise is that businesses also have independent legal responsibilities to respect human rights. Now, not every jurisdiction is great for bringing claims on human rights grounds, but some places it has been very helpful. So if you want, I could give you some examples.
Yes, please. That was going to be my next question. Give me some examples. What you consider like the cases that exemplify this strategy and have been super successful for you?
Well, I start out with one that is probably the nearest and dearest to my heart. So in 2013, Typhoon Haiyan hit the Philippines. 6,000 people lost their lives. Millions were displaced. At the same time, around this time, there was a global climate negotiation going on. And one of the representatives on the Philippines delegation was a man named Yeb Sano. And if you do anything later tonight, Google Yeb Sano climate negotiations speech. And on the floor, he began telling the story of what was happening back in the Philippines with Typhoon Haiyan. And it was in the days and weeks afterwards that people started asking the question, why is this happening and who is responsible? Also around the same time, a piece of research came out called the Carbon Majors Data. It was done by an independent researcher named Richard Heady. This data found that 2/3 of global emissions, historical emissions up to, I forget the year 2013, came from just a few dozen carbon producers. You're gonna know who these companies are, these carbon producers. It's Exxon, Shell, Chevron, Eni. These are the carbon producers, the majority. So it started to become really clear, not just to researchers in the United States, but to communities on the ground, who was responsible for making the extreme weather events more stronger and more damaging and more lethal. And so using that data, 2 years later, we saw communities file a first ever legal complaint. And this legal complaint was filed not in a court of law, but in a national human rights institution. This is a constitutionally created independent legal body to hear human rights complaints. They brought the complaint and they asked the Commission on Human Rights to investigate. So just to investigate the responsibility of these companies, these carbon producers, for climate change. These are companies that have extracted, produced, and sold fossil fuels on a massive scale. The communities over the course of 7 years, yes, 7 long years, I think 12 hearings, different parts of the world, many witnesses, put forward that these companies should be held accountable. And then in 2022, the Commission on Human Rights of the Philippines issued its final report. And that final report provided some key findings. One of the findings is that the carbon majors, yes, indeed, were some of the largest contributors to the climate change that we're experiencing now. They also found that these companies had very early knowledge of the problem. So knowledge as early as 1965, that carbon emissions from their products, when used as directed, would cause the harm that we are seeing today and that the Filipinos experienced. The report also started to lay out a roadmap for the basis for liability. and the liability based on human rights law and tort law and all different types of claims. So this was a landmark report. Did it find any particular company liable? No. But it laid out a roadmap, and it put out all the evidence that can be used by communities around the world to hold fossil fuel companies responsible for climate change. So that's one example.
So, and do you see kind of this report as being the basis for further litigation, further moves on that front? How do you think this is developing as we speak?
I think that the report, and not just the report, but everything that went on up into getting that report into, being announced, was really what is inspiring for people who have been made vulnerable by climate change. So we are going to see copycats of these types of investigations and litigation happen all around the world. And another example, if I can show you, is it okay?
Of course, of course.
Okay. Another example I would like to bring to your attention is a case that was brought first in 2019. So around the same kind of period of time, Milieu Defensie, which is Friends of the Earth in the Netherlands, Greenpeace Netherlands, and 17,000 individuals sued Shell in the Netherlands. Now, this case was successful, and it was inspired by an earlier case, a government framework case that was filed by Urgenda Foundation against the Dutch government. So what happened in this case, really important. The court found that there is, underneath the Dutch civil code, that there is a standard of care that both the government and private companies, so Shell, have, and if they violate it, then they can be held liable. And they interpreted this standard of care looking at human rights law, looking at soft and hard and binding principles. It really took it all in. And the court ordered that Shell reduce its emissions by 45% by 2030 on 2019 levels. Groundbreaking, massive finding. It was upheld on appeal. It's now on appeal, I should say. So it's moving through the courts. But this is an exciting development. And there's more cases like this happening. Greenpeace Italy against Eni. We see RWE, which is a German energy company sued by a Peruvian farmer. So these cases are spreading, and they're inspiring, and they're giving people who are harmed by climate change a platform for them to tell their stories, where they have agency, and they can change the power dynamics that are happening in the world, and they're winning.
This is fascinating, Christine. Can I ask something that we discussed in our conversation as we're preparing for this? So the example that he gave, the outcome of the litigation is a big governance change, essentially, about how Shell should move forward from now on. In the US, the model of litigation is mostly focused on compensation and monetary awards, which is a different approach. So you've been, you are an international actor and you play on all these different fields. So what do you think about these two different models of litigation and making demands from companies? Which one is more likely to be effective?
Wow, I think it's to be seen. But I would say that when I travel around and I speak with everyone, everyone's eyes are on California right now. With the people of California versus Exxon, Chevron, and American Petroleum Institute, the API, that case that has a clear request for a nuisance abatement fund to be set up is something everyone is watching. And I think that we will be seeing the litigation that's happening on climate change in Europe and other places we see is more on the corporate policy level, trying to shift corporate policy. Here in the US, we see these climate cost recovery cases. And I think that they're very different, and we don't know which one is going to be seen. But I do think that the California case is something that is being watched and potentially replicated in jurisdictions around the world. So I think that that's really exciting. We'll be looking for that.
Okay, great. So now I'll ask you the question that every corporate lawyer wants to ask you. which is, one of the concerns with increased disclosure of climate-related data, emissions by companies. Everybody is concerned that this is going to lead to more litigation. So are you reading these reports carefully, thinking, who is going to be my next target? So, or if you're not doing it personally, what do you think? Is this kind of the new wave of disclosure that is going to come up as a result of California laws, as a result of SEC rules, as a result of European rules that we discussed yesterday? Are these going to be the basis for more litigation in the future?
I think that is an excellent question. And I think I might say something that you might be surprised with. But I would say that the reporting, and especially accurate and honest and fair reporting, is going to be reduce litigation risk. And there's been so much said at this conference about what's in those reports versus what's in kind of when companies are climate washing cases, which is a whole new thread of cases that we're seeing, what are said in the kind of non-official reports and advertise me. That stuff I think is actually where people are watching the most. When I sit down with friends or, some of my friends from college who have moved on and are in the C-suite and are in corporate centers, they often ask me, like, what are your tips on this to avoid litigation?
They're stealing my questions.
Oh, sorry. Okay, we'll go there then. But I don't
Go.
But I don't think that, okay, well, I'll go there. But I think that it's about being honest about what is really the state of corporate policies on climate and biodiversity and putting that out there. I also think that we need to ensure that companies are really meaningfully saying how they're aligning with the best available science. And that's something that I think it's not about the Paris targets or this, it's about the best available science. And right now what we know is that even at 1 degree warming, we're having human rights harms. People are being affected, whether we're here in California, Colorado, Pakistan. I was talking with someone at the cocktail hour about the situation. So about that. And then the next thing I say is before you go and you work on that reporting, sit down with your kid or your grandkid and act as if you love children above all else. And that's what Greta said. And I think that we need to go into the framework of reporting with that in our mind.
So let me pause from litigation for a little bit and ask you, since you brought up this question of greenwashing and transition and the arguments, one of the issues that I wanted to ask you is we've heard how complicated transition is going to be. Yeah. It's a process that it's going to take some time, and a lot of people are arguing we cannot transition right now, even if we wanted it. There are a lot of things to consider. It's going to slow down. What do you make of this argument? Is how far are we from transitioning? How difficult is it from your perspective? And what do you make of the conversation?
I think that narrative could be a new form of climate denialism. What we see is that at first, climate change wasn't real. Then we saw that climate change, wasn't going to have the impacts it is now having. Now it's that the solutions can't be adopted fast enough. So I question and I call back on that and wonder, what is the honest, truthful answer of what we need to do? And it is hard, right? It is hard. We know it. We see it in our hometowns of what that transition means. I mean, I live in Boulder, one of the most committed cities on the planet, and you see how hard it is for our local officials to do the transition that we know needs to happen. But I do think that we need to shift the narrative. And I do believe that the technologies, the solutions are all here. It's about the political will, and it's about us changing the narrative and that we can do this. So I question it. I wonder if it is a new form of climate denial.
Okay. So back to litigation, I wanted to. So if disclosure is, if it's honest and truthful, it's not going to lead to more litigation. What is going to lead to more litigation? Where do you see? What are the frontiers of litigation, kind of moving forward? Where would we expect action?
So I think that what I'm going to go back to aligning with best available science and policies that are not aligned with that, and new investments in fossil fuels is particularly one. So I'm going to bring in one more case example.
Okay.
One more case example. So I'm sure you've heard of the Grantham Institute. They do fantastic research on climate litigation and legislation. So go and look it up. But they talk about different categories of litigation. So we've already talked about like corporate framework cases, like challenging corporate policies on climate. Talked about government cases. Then there's the kind of turning off the tap cases. And I think that we're going to see every single time there's major new fossil fuel extraction projects that they're going to be challenged. And we recently secured an incredible victory in Norway. So Greenpeace Norway and Young Friends of the Earth Norway successfully invalidated the license for 3 oil fields in the North Sea. They had another case that was brought earlier, a couple of years before that, where they lost, but the Supreme Court said, if you're going to do new licensing, you have to do an environmental impact assessment that really looks at the climate risks, the climate impact of these fields, and they didn't do those with these 3. So these 3 new licenses were invalidated. So I think that there's that litigation. So if there's new fossil fuel projects, they're going to be challenged, and NGOs and communities are learning from each other. We are talking all the time. We're learning from each other's tactics. We're seeing the arguments that we're making, and we're getting better and better at mobilizing people and the law and the science and the facts to win. The other areas, I think, is going to be on biodiversity. And there may be different reasons why biodiversity has not been the focus of a lot of litigation, and I think that we see a lot more research going into it, looking at particularly the agribusiness, meat industry, looking at methane, like those areas are going to be big. But then the other one, and I think is going to be financial actors, financial institutions. Oh. So Frank Elderson, he's a member of the ECB executive board. Google the speech, "Come Hell or High Water," absolutely critical speech to read. As we're starting to see banks, ING has been sued in the Netherlands. We're going to be seeing more and more of that litigation. And it will be the role, and what is interesting is that financial institutions have a large systemic impact. Instead of going company by company to challenge climate policies, going to the banks that fund many destructive business practices is maybe a more successful route. We have such limited time to address the climate crisis that litigation needs to get much more sophisticated at having a larger impact in a shorter period of time.
That's fascinating. And how about plastics? So I thought that this was kind of something that is on many people's minds because we've seen a lot of campaigns around that. It's also an item that consumers use a lot. Yeah. So it's very much on people's minds. So I was wondering about that.
Yeah, plastics come out on top of when we talk to supporters around the world and the different Greenpeace organizations. Plastics is a huge concern. And there's the nexus between the petrochemical industry and plastics. And so we see this coming. There's only early signs. It's not something that I personally am working on at the moment, but I think that could be another area where we will see litigation ramp up in the years to come. But we'll see.
So let me I know we're towards the end of our time, so let me ask what kind of advice you have for the corporations that are now in the room? How should they see you, and what do they need to be aware of? What do they need to change if they want to avoid being targeted in litigation?
That's a great question. I think it's important to define stakeholders broadly. Mm-hmm. One of the main requirements that we are demanding in our cases, so there's some very big international bodies that are looking at climate change right now. Mm-hmm. There's the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, the International Court of Justice, the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. Mm-hmm. And those cases, they focus on governments and what governments should do. But governments have a responsibility to regulate, mm-hmm. right? And due diligence is one of the main things that corporations need to be doing, and especially in the climate context, and looking at the full value chain. So talking with communities, especially the communities that are being hit the hardest by climate impacts, are really key. And so to have those conversations. And I think that engaging in the cases and reading them and understanding what is going on, like bringing, if you're advising, if you're an in-house counsel, making sure that you're doing really good notes, briefing notes on all the litigation to go to the directors for them to read so they start really understanding this, because this is just the tip of the iceberg. This is really just the start. The wave of litigation is coming, it's happening, and every company is probably going to be affected. So get on top of it really early. Can I read one poem?
Yes.
Do I have time for it?
Yes, I was going to ask for any final words of wisdom, so please.
Noticeably absent in this room are the people, most of us that are on the front lines of the climate crisis. And I was able to work with an amazing team of lawyers and non-lawyers to submit a brief to the International Court of Justice just a couple days ago. And our brief really tries to bring the voices of the people that are hit, that are on the front lines, that are surviving, hopefully thriving and fighting back. And I really want to read this very short poem. It's by the Marshallese poet, Kathy Gentile I'm saying that right, Kingener. And the poem is called Tell Them. After all this, tell them about the water, how we have seen it rising, flooding across our cemeteries, gushing over the seawalls, crashing against our homes. Tell them what it is like to see the entire ocean level with the land. Tell them we are afraid. Tell them we don't know of the politics of the science, but tell them we see what is in our own backyard. Thank you.